There are people witches fear in silence, people they monitor but cannot penetrate. Why? What invisible force surrounds them so heavily that even dark altars back away? An ex-witch once revealed this terrifying truth: there are four kinds of people the kingdom of darkness avoids at all costs, and if you are one of them, hell already knows your name. The first people witches can never truly touch are those completely covered by authentic spiritual fire, not religious activity, not empty church, language, not public performance, real fire, the kind that burns in private, the kind built through prayer when nobody is watching, the kind formed through fasting, obedience, tears, repentance, and daily surrender. Witches understand something many believers ignore. Fire is not symbolism to them. It is a spiritual defense system. There are believers the kingdom of darkness studies carefully. They send monitoring spirits. They attempt spiritual projections. They release confusion, fear, oppression, and strange attacks at night. But every attempt crashes. Why? Because some people carry an atmosphere but cannot be invaded. The ex-witch explained that certain Christians appear untouchable in the spirit realm because they are constantly spiritually charged. Demons approach them and encounter resistance immediately, not because those believers are perfect, but because they are spiritually alive. This is why some people panic every time attacks come, while others remain stable in the middle of chaos. Fire changes your spiritual climate. You must understand this. Darkness looks for cold environments, compromised environments, prayerless environments, emotionally broken environments, spiritually sleeping environments. That is where attacks multiply. But when a believer becomes spiritually consistent, something terrifying begins happening in the unseen realm. Their spirit stops leaking weakness, and witches hate spiritually disciplined people. Why? Creates authority. Many believers pray only during emergencies. That creates unstable spiritual patterns. 1 week on fire, 3 weeks distracted, 1 night praying, 10 nights entertaining compromise. The kingdom of darkness studies inconsistency, and they exploit it. But there are people who pray whether they feel emotional or not, people who worship through pain, people who fast when nobody announces it, people who protect their spiritual atmosphere aggressively. Those are the believers. Witches struggle to influence. The ex-witch describes seeing believers surrounded by intense spiritual light after prolonged periods of consecration. Not physical light, spiritual authority. And when attacks were sent against them, the attacks returned empty. Some of you watching this have survived battles you still do not understand. You thought it was luck. It was not luck. Your prayers blocked things you never saw. Your fasting interrupted things assigned against you. Your obedience cancelled traps before they form fully. There are accidents you should have entered. There are demonic covenants that try to pull your family down. There are strange spiritual arrows released at your mind. But somehow, you survived, because darkness does not have unlimited access. This is why your spiritual habits matter more than your emotions. Feelings come and go. Fire must remain. And this is where many believers fail. They want authority without sacrifice, power without discipline, victory without separation. But spiritual fire costs something. It costs distractions. It costs compromise. It costs hidden sin. It costs pride, and witches know this deeply. They know weak believers are easier to influence. A spiritually weak believer becomes vulnerable to confusion, sudden anger, heavy lust, constant fear, night oppression, strange depression, chaotic thinking, because spiritual doors remain open. But when someone begins cleansing their life seriously, darkness notices immediately. Suddenly they stop entertaining corruption. They stop feeding toxic habits. They become intentional about prayer, intentional about purity, intentional about protecting their mind. And the spiritual atmosphere changes. You have to understand something disturbing. Witches do not fear Christians who only speak loudly. They fear believers carrying genuine authority. There is a difference. Some people know religious language. Others carry spiritual weight. Weight is built privately. That is why Jesus warned about secret prayer, because private altars create public protection. The ex-witch explained that some attacks completely fail because the targeted believer had unknowingly built strong spiritual walls through daily communion with God. The witchcraft assignment arrived, but the access point was closed. Some of you need to hear this carefully. Not every attack requires panic. Some attacks expose how powerful your spiritual covering already is. You survived because heaven was fighting for you. And here is another terrifying truth. Witches often avoid believers who quickly discern spiritual manipulation. Discernment destroys ambushes. When someone becomes spiritually alert, they recognize strange influences faster. They recognize spiritual heaviness. They recognize demonic patterns. They recognize environments carrying darkness. And that awareness weakens the enemy's advantage. This is why the enemy constantly fights your prayer life. Because prayer sharpens discernment. Prayer increases sensitivity. Prayer strengthens your inner man. Prayer keeps your spiritual fire alive. The kingdom of darkness does not want you spiritually awake. They want you distracted, numb, entertained, spiritually exhausted. Because exhausted believers stop resisting. But when a believer becomes spiritually consistent, something changes dramatically. Their words carry force, their atmosphere carries authority, their presence disrupts darkness. Have you ever noticed that certain people enter a room and suddenly tension changes? Not because of personality, because of spiritual presence. Demons recognize carriers of fire faster than humans do. That is why some of you have faced irrational opposition your entire life. You thought people hated you randomly. Number. Sometimes darkness inside people reacts to the authority developing on your life. And the deeper your consecration becomes, the more difficult it becomes for witchcraft to operate freely around you. The ex-witch revealed that many witches specifically avoid targeting believers known for deep prayer lives. Why? Because spiritual backlash becomes dangerous. Some attacks rebound violently when directed at spiritually protected individuals. This is why you cannot afford spiritual laziness in this season. Too much is happening spiritually. Too many believers are sleeping while warfare intensifies. You need fire again. Not emotional hype, not motivational speeches, real spiritual fire, the kind built through consistency, the kind built through surrender, the kind that terrifies darkness before you even speak. And hear this carefully. Witches cannot dominate believers fully submitted to God's authority. Submission creates covering. Many people want spiritual power while resisting obedience. But rebellion weakens protection. The safest place spiritually is alignment with God. Not perfection. Alignment. Some of you need to return to prayer immediately. Some of you need to cleanse your environment. Of you need to disconnect from influences draining your spirit daily. Because spiritual fire can weaken slowly without you noticing, and cold believers become easier targets. But today something is awakening inside you. You are realizing your spiritual condition matters deeply. You are realizing prayer is not routine, it is survival. You are realizing holiness is not outdated, it is protection. And if you become fully consumed with genuine spiritual fire, darkness will recognize what many witches already know. Some believers cannot be touched easily anymore, because heaven itself surrounds them. The second people witches can never truly touch are those walking in radical obedience to God. This is where many spiritual attacks lose their power completely. Because obedience closes doors darkness depends on. The ex-witch revealed something deeply disturbing. Many witchcraft attacks do not begin with power. They begin with access. Access through compromise. Access through disobedience. Access through hidden agreement with darkness. And most believers never realize it. They think spiritual warfare is only about demons attacking randomly. But the kingdom of darkness studies legal openings carefully. Bitterness, unforgiveness, secret sin, pride, rebellion, persistent disobedience. These things weaken spiritual walls slowly. And witches understand this principle far more seriously than many believers do. That is why obedience terrifies hell, because obedience shuts doors. Some people pray constantly but still live in compromise. That creates spiritual conflict inside them. They want protection while entertaining the very things destroying their covering. But there are believers who decide something dangerous. They decide to obey God completely, even when it costs relationships, even when it costs comfort, even when nobody understands them. Those believers become difficult to manipulate spiritually, because obedience activates divine alignment. You must understand this carefully. Darkness thrives where disorder exists, but obedience creates spiritual order, and spiritual order releases protection. This is why certain believers escape traps others fall into repeatedly. God warned them, and they listened. The ex-witch described how some individuals became impossible to influence because they obeyed divine warnings quickly. They avoided certain places, disconnected from toxic people, ended sinful relationships, stopped participating in spiritually contaminated activities. And because they obeyed, disasters were interrupted before manifesting physically. Some of you are alive today because you obeyed a warning you almost ignored. You felt uncomfortable somewhere. You sensed danger around someone. You felt convicted about a habit destroying your spirit. And when you obeyed, something shifted. That was not coincidence. That was spiritual preservation. The kingdom of darkness hates obedient believers because obedient believers are harder to deceive. Deception becomes weaker when someone lives close to God. Their discernment sharpens, the sensitivity increases, their conscience becomes alive again. And this is where many people fail spiritually. They normalize disobedience, small compromises, small lies, small corruptions. But small doors eventually become large entrances. The enemy rarely destroys people suddenly. He weakens them gradually, one compromise at a time, one distraction at a time, one act of rebellion at a time, until spiritual sensitivity disappears. And once sensitivity dies, danger increases dramatically. That is why obedience matters more than emotional excitement. Some people feel spiritual during worship but ignore God afterward. Others quietly obey Him daily. And heaven recognizes the difference. The ex-witch explained that some believers carried invisible protection because they consistently obeyed convictions immediately. When God said move, they moved. When God said stop, they stopped. When God exposed hidden sin, they repented quickly. That obedience builds spiritual security around them. You need to hear this carefully. Delayed obedience can become dangerous because sometimes God warns you before attacks fully develop, before betrayal happens, before destruction unfolds, before demonic traps activate. And many believers ignore those warnings until consequences arrive. But obedient believers move quickly, even when they do not understand fully. And witches struggle against people, fully guided by God's Spirit. Why? Because divine guidance disrupts demonic strategy. Imagine darkness preparing a trap for someone, but suddenly God redirects them completely. The assignment collapses. This happens more than people realize. There are relationships God ended to protect you, jobs God blocked to preserve you, places God prevented you from entering. Some of you cried over closed doors that actually saved your life spiritually. The ex-witch revealed that certain witchcraft assignments failed simply because the intended target obeyed God unexpectedly. One act of obedience destroyed months of demonic preparation. This is why Satan fights your obedience aggressively. He knows obedience strengthens your covering. And hear this carefully. Obedience is not weakness, it is warfare. Every time you reject temptation, warfare is happening. Every time you forgive instead of becoming bitter, warfare is happening. Every time you walk away from corruption, warfare is happening. Every time you choose purity over compromise, warfare is happening. And heaven responds to obedience. Some believers want authority without submission, but authority flows through alignment. Jesus himself demonstrated obedience repeatedly, even under pressure, even in suffering, even when betrayal surrounded him. Obedience carries spiritual power, and which is no rebellious believers are easier to manipulate emotionally. Rebellion opens emotional instability, confusion, pride, impulsiveness, self-destruction. But obedient believers develop stability. Their spirit becomes grounded. Their decisions become clearer. Their atmosphere becomes stronger. This is why some attacks fail before they even begin. The targeted believer already lives under divine instruction, and darkness struggles against people who remain spiritually aligned. Some of you keep asking why warfare intensified after you started obeying God seriously. Here is why. Your obedience threatened something. You became harder to control, harder to deceive, harder to pull backward spiritually. Darkness attacks growing believers aggressively because transformation disrupts old access points. The enemy hates when doors begin closing, and obedience closes many doors permanently. That is why your environment matters, your conversations matter, your entertainment choices matter, your hidden habits matter, because everything affects spiritual sensitivity. Some believers destroy their discernment slowly through constant compromise. Then suddenly they cannot recognize danger anymore. But obedient believers remain spiritually alert. And alert believers are difficult to ambush. The ex-witch described obedient Christians as spiritually guarded, not because life became perfect, but because God actively directed their steps. There is terrifying protection in divine guidance. One instruction from God can preserve your future completely. One act of obedience can destroy an entire demonic setup. That is why you cannot keep resisting convictions. When God tells you to let something go, obey. When God tells you to separate from someone, obey. When God tells you to return to holiness, obey. Because your obedience may be protecting you from battles you cannot even see yet. And hear this final truth carefully. Witches cannot fully dominate believers who remain surrendered to God daily. Because surrender keeps heaven involved. Some people only seek God during crisis, others walk with Him continuously. Continuous relationship becomes spiritual protection. So if you want to become untouchable spiritually, stop treating obedience casually. Obedience is not religion, it is survival, it is protection, it is alignment. And every step of obedience weakens darkness around your life more than you realize. The third people witches can never truly touch are those protected by generational covenant and relentless intercession. This is where the kingdom of darkness becomes deeply frustrated, because some people are covered by prayers they did not even know were fighting for them. The ex-witch reveals something shocking. There are individuals witches attempt to attack repeatedly, yet invisible resistance keeps appearing around them. Unexpected interruptions, failed spiritual projections, blocked attacks, sudden reversals, and many times the targeted person has no idea why. But somewhere, someone is praying. A praying mother, a fasting grandmother, a father crying out secretly before God, spiritual mentor interceding consistently. Darkness hates intercessors because intercession builds spiritual walls around people and families. This is why some families experience constant destruction generation after generation, while other families survive impossible battles repeatedly. Some bloodlines are heavily covered spiritually. You need to understand this deeply. Prayer does not only affect the present moment, prayer can preserve futures. There are parents praying protection over children who have not yet seen the dangers surrounding them. There are grandparents whose prayers continue protecting descendants long after they leave this earth, and witches know this. The ex-witch explained that some families become extremely difficult to penetrate because generations of prayer created spiritual resistance over the household. Not perfection, protection. There is a difference. Some of you survived seasons where you were spiritually weak, emotionally unstable, and dangerously distracted. Yet somehow you were still preserved. Why? Because somebody's prayers were standing between you and destruction. You thought you escaped by intelligence, number, intercession covered you. There are accidents that should have happened, addictions that should have consumed you, relationships that should have destroyed your destiny. But prayer interrupted the outcome. This is why the enemy attacks prayer warriors so aggressively. Because intercessors are spiritual gatekeepers. They detect danger early. They confront darkness directly. They fight battles others never even notice. And witches fear households saturated with consistent prayer, not occasional prayer, consistent prayer. Because consistent prayer changes spiritual atmosphere permanently. Some homes feel heavy immediately when you enter. Confusion, anger, tension, oppression, but other homes carry peace, strength, clarity, spiritual rest. That atmosphere did not happen accidentally. Someone built it spiritually. Ex-witch described certain homes as untouchable territories because prayer had saturated the environment deeply for years. Attacks sent against those homes struggled to gain entrance. You need to hear this carefully. Never underestimate praying people. Some believers appear quiet physically, but dangerous spiritually. Hell studies intercessors carefully because intercession weakens demonic assignments before they manifest physically. This is why many attacks begin in the spirit before, appearing naturally. But prayer intercepts things early. Prayer exposes hidden dangers. Prayer destroys invisible plans. And this is where many believers become careless. They stop praying over their family, stop praying over their children, stop praying over their home, stop praying over their future. Then suddenly spiritual attacks increase because uncovered environments become vulnerable environments. The kingdom of darkness looks for prayerless territories, prayerless minds, marriages, prayerless homes, because silence creates opportunity. But when consistent intercession rises, darkness loses freedom to operate comfortably. The ex-witch explained that witches sometimes avoid targeting certain people simply because too much prayer surrounded them constantly. The spiritual resistance became exhausting. Think about that. Your prayers can make darkness uncomfortable. Your prayers can shift spiritual climates around your family. Your prayers can preserve lives. Some of you are the reason your household has not collapsed completely. You thought your prayers were weak, but heaven heard every cry, every midnight prayer, every exhausted prayer, every desperate prayer over your children, every tear-filled prayer over your marriage, every whispered prayer during fear. None of it was wasted. And hear this carefully. Intercession becomes even more powerful when combined with covenant. A covenant relationship with God creates spiritual identity. Identity matters deeply in warfare because darkness attacks confusion first. If the enemy can disconnect you from your spiritual identity, he weakens your authority. But believers who know who they are spiritually become harder to intimidate. The ex-witch revealed that confident believers carrying deep assurance in God often disrupted witchcraft attacks immediately. Why? Because fear gives darkness room, but spiritual confidence resists intimidation. This is why the enemy constantly attacks your mind. He wants insecurity, condemnation, hopelessness, shame, because broken identity weakens resistance. But when someone fully understands they belong to God, something shifts spiritually. They stop panicking constantly. They stop surrendering mentally. They stop agreeing with fear. And witches struggle against believers carrying strong covenant awareness. Some of you need to stop speaking like defeated people. Stop talking like abandoned people. Stop thinking heaven forgot you. You are covered more than you realize. The enemy wants you isolated because isolation weakens spiritual endurance. But covenant reminds you that you are connected to God's protection, connected to His authority, connected to His promises. And this becomes dangerous to darkness. The ex-witch explained that fear-driven believers became easier to oppress spiritually. But confident believers disrupted attacks quickly because they resisted mentally and spiritually. You must understand this. Your words matter. Your agreement matters. Your mindset matters. Because fear can open doors emotionally, but faith strengthens spiritual resistance. This does not mean believers never feel afraid. It means they refuse to surrender to fear permanently. And this is where intercessors become critical. Intercessors strengthen others during weak seasons. Sometimes your own faith becomes exhausted, but somebody else keeps praying until your strength returns. That is why spiritual community matters. Isolation destroys many believers, slowly. But connected believers remain stronger during warfare. The enemy wants silence, but intercession breaks silence violently. And hear this final truth carefully. Witches cannot easily destroy people heavily covered in prayer and deeply rooted in covenant identity. Because heaven responds to covenant, heaven responds to intercession, heaven responds to persistent faith. Some of you need to become the intercessor your family desperately needs. Because one praying person can shift an entire household spiritually. One consistent prayer life can break patterns operating for generations. One surrendered believer can become a wall against darkness for countless others. And when prayer becomes consistent, covenant becomes personal, and identity becomes stable, the kingdom of darkness begins recognizing something terrifying. This person is no longer spiritually exposed. The fourth people witches can never truly touch are those chosen for divine assignment and fully awakened to their purpose. This is the category darkness fears the most, because purpose carries protection. The ex-witch revealed something terrifying. Certain believers were marked heavily in the spirit realm long before they understood who they were. Witches monitored them. Attacks intensified around them early in life. Chaos followed them constantly. Why? Because darkness recognized a future threat before the person recognized it themselves. Some of you have spent years asking why your life has felt like non-stop warfare, why betrayal follows you, why strange resistance appears every time you move forward, why certain attacks started even during childhood. It was not random. Hell attacks purpose aggressively, especially purpose capable of setting others free. The kingdom of darkness does not waste energy carelessly. It targets people carrying dangerous potential, people capable of exposing darkness, people capable of breaking generational chains, people capable of awakening others spiritually. And the ex-witch explained that many spiritually targeted individuals later discovered powerful divine assignments attached to their lives. That is why warfare surrounded them early. The enemy attacks what threatens his kingdom. You need to understand this carefully. Some of your greatest battles are connected to your calling, because purpose terrifies darkness. A believer who fully awakens spiritually becomes difficult to contain. Their words begin shifting lives. Their prayers begin breaking oppression. Their obedience begins changing environments. And witches fear spiritually awakened believers because awakened believers stop cooperating with darkness unknowingly. This is why the enemy fights identity so intensely. If he can keep you confused about your purpose, he can delay your impact. And many believers spend years trapped in distraction, years trapped in insecurity, years trapped in fear, while carrying dangerous spiritual potential the entire time. The ex-witch described seeing believers who carried enormous spiritual authority without even realizing it yet. Darkness attacked them repeatedly, hoping discouragement would stop them before maturity developed. And this happens constantly. Some people quit right before breakthrough, right before transformation, right before purpose activates fully, because warfare exhausted them mentally. But hear this carefully. Survival itself is evidence. You survive because your assignment still matters. The enemy tried to crush you emotionally, tried to bury your confidence, tried to corrupt your destiny, tried to trap you in cycles of failure, but you are still here. That means something greater is still attached to your life. And once a believer becomes fully awakened to purpose, spiritual authority increases dramatically. Because clarity changes everything. Confused people hesitate. Awakened people move with conviction. And conviction becomes dangerous to darkness. The ex-witch explained that many witches avoid highly purposeful believers because their spiritual momentum becomes difficult to stop. These believers become spiritually focused, disciplined, bold, consistent, and once purpose and discipline combine together, demonic interference weakens significantly. This is why the enemy constantly pushes distraction. Distraction delays purpose, and delayed purpose benefits darkness. Some believers spend years consumed by entertainment, compromise, toxic relationships, and emotional chaos while there. Calling slowly suffocates. But when someone finally awakens spiritually, they begin cutting distractions aggressively. They become intentional, focused, dangerous spiritually. And witches recognize focused believers quickly, because focused believers stop leaking energy into meaningless battles. Some of you are entering a season where clarity is returning. You are beginning to recognize patterns, recognize attacks, recognize manipulations, recognize distractions designed to waste your future. That awakening is spiritual. The enemy wanted you numb permanently, but heaven is pulling you out of confusion. And here is another truth many people never understand. Purpose creates endurance. People without purpose collapse faster during warfare. But purposeful people keep moving even while wounded. Why? Because something bigger than pain drives them. The ex-witch revealed that spiritually awakened believers often survived attacks that should have mentally destroyed them. Because deep inside, purpose kept pulling them forward. Some of you should have given up years ago according to what you faced. But something refused to let you quit completely. That was purpose fighting to survive inside you. And darkness fears believers who stop running from their assignment. Because once you embrace your calling fully, your confidence changes, your prayer life changes, your discernment changes, your authority changes. You stop begging darkness to leave you alone. You begin confronting it boldly. And this is where many believers become spiritually dangerous, not arrogant, awakened. The ex-witch explained that darkness especially fears believers who combine purpose with complete surrender to God. Because those believers become spiritually unstoppable, not because they never struggle, but because they refuse to abandon their assignment. And hear this carefully. Your purpose is not only about you. Other people are connected to your obedience. Your breakthrough may free others. Your testimony may awaken others. Your courage may strengthen others. That is why the enemy fought your voice so hard. That is why insecurity attacked you repeatedly. That is why discouragement followed you constantly. Darkness wanted silence, because silence protects evil. But awakened believers expose darkness by existing boldly. And witches fear believers who stop hiding spiritually. Some of you have been shrinking yourselves for years, staying quiet, staying fearful, staying spiritually passive. But heaven is calling you into boldness now. Because passive believers rarely threaten darkness deeply, but awakened believers disrupt entire spiritual environments. The ex-witch described purposeful believers as carrying movement around them spiritually. Their lives created impact. Freedom followed them. Conviction followed them. Transformation followed them. Darkness hates transformative believers because transformation spreads. One awakened believer can awaken many others, and suddenly the enemy loses territory. That is why your warfare intensified after you started growing spiritually. Growth threatens darkness. Maturity threatens darkness. Purpose threatens darkness. But hear this final truth carefully. Witches cannot stop a believer fully protected by God's purpose and fully surrendered to His will. They may attack, they may resist, they may attempt intimidation. But divine assignment carries divine backing. And when heaven authorizes your life, some of you have underestimated yourselves for too long. You thought you were weak because battles increased. But sometimes intense warfare is evidence that your spiritual significance is greater than you realized. Hell does not fear empty vessels. It fears awakened believers carrying fire, obedience, covenant, and purpose. And if you fully awaken to who God called you to become, Darkness will recognize what witches already know. You were never meant to remain spiritually vulnerable again. You are not helpless. You are not spiritually abandoned. And you are not surrounded without protection. If God has marked your life, no altar can erase your destiny. No witch can cancel what heaven has already authorized. Rise in prayer. Rise in obedience. Rise in fire and let darkness learn the hard way that you are no longer easy to touch.